In Conversation with Terry Shepard, award-winning broadcaster, narrator, and author. A deep dive into the writer's craft with the artists and support systems who create the stories we love.
Thanks, Lisa. Today's guest brings a memoir unlike any other. A lyrical, genre-defying meditation on grief, legacy, and the invisible threads that bind generations. When Marty Ross-Dolen's grandparents were killed in a midair plane collision in 1960, it marked a loss her family would carry for decades. Her mother was only 14. Marty grew up in the shadow of that grief. And in her newly released memoir, Always There, Always Gone, she weaves prose, poetry, photographs, and found materials into a powerful tapestry of memory and healing. A retired child and adolescent psychiatrist and a graduate of Wellesley, Einstein, and Vermont College of Fine Arts, Marty Ross-Dolen brings a rare blend of clinical insight and poetic grace to her storytelling. Marty Ross-Dolen, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Terry. It's a pleasure to be here.
Your resume is a fascinating story in itself. When you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a doctor. I have the autobiography that we write when we're in third or fourth grade. Mine said neurosurgeon, which is not what I ended up, but I knew that I wanted to be a doctor. My father was a doctor and I wanted to do what he did. But I also wanted to be a writer. And my favorite part of any class at any age was the writing assignment. And I even did some summer camp things that were writing camps. So I think I wanted to be both.
What was the influence for that?
I can't say for sure. I think that it was my way of having creative expression, and I enjoyed the experience of having teachers read what I wrote and comment, and I enjoyed writing poems. I think it was just my creative expression, my outlet.
We have a lot of authors that listen to this show. How did you learn to take criticism?
I don't know that I was getting criticism as young as fourth grade or fifth grade. I'm not sure that I think they were more trying to encourage than discourage at that age. I will say that I wasn't the best English student. I wasn't then this might seem odd, but I wasn't a great reader. I have never been one to really understand some of the maybe poetry or old classics that might be considered less accessible. It just didn't necessarily come to me. So there were times when I clearly was trying to write about things that I didn't understand, and then I would receive criticism. And I guess we are always getting it, right? It's criticism, rejections. It's just the name of the game. And it's just a moving on. And not everybody has to like what I write. It's not a requirement.
When did you first feel the pull to tell the deeply personal and multi-generational story that became Always There, Always Gone?
So I began writing the book 14 years ago, and the story sort of starts in 1960, and then it starts for me as I became aware of the loss that my mother had of her parents when she was young, and that happened for me as a child. But the writing about it I wasn't inspired to start writing until I attended a 50th memorial event of 50th anniversary of the airplane accident. And after I attended, and there's a lot of backstory in those 50 years, but once I attended that memorial in Brooklyn in 2010, a few months later, I sat down and just started to write about that. And then I also started to go back and try to tell what I needed to tell about the story, but only in an essay form. And I wrote an essay. I'd say it was long. It was maybe about 40 pages. But I wrote that hoping those of us that use creative nonfiction to process our lives and our stories and our lives, I am one of those people, and I wrote that essay with the hope that I had processed this part of my life. And I took the essay. I was taking a class at The Ohio State University, a workshop, and shared the essay and received a lot of feedback from my peers. Actually, they weren't peers because I was pretty old in that class at the time. They were on the younger side, but they all gave me wonderful feedback. And then at the end of the semester, the professor said to me, when he was giving me feedback, he said, "I think that you might be writing a book." And when I learned that, when he said that, I remember my stomach sank because I didn't want to write a book. I didn't want to write a book about this. I wanted to be done because it was painful to write that essay. And how was I supposed to write a whole book about this? So my reaction to his suggestion was that I went home and I took all of, it was in print, all of those, a large pile of paper of feedback, and I stuck it into a cabinet, and it stayed there for 10 years. During that 10 years, my mom was starting to accumulate the personal letters of my grandmother. And I was asking her if I could have them. And she would send them to me as she would find them. She was the archivist of our family business. And she sent them to me or delivered them to me herself. And I compiled, just put those in bins and put them in my basement. So I had this pile of essays in my cabinet, and I had this bins of letters in my basement, and I had a feeling that I had to tell a story, and I knew I had to tell the story in a different way from that essay. And then the pandemic happened, and it offered me an opportunity to get my MFA because it was going to be remote through a low residency program. So I had the letters, I had the essay, and I had time, and I had very brilliant people helping me as faculty advisors in the program. And that's the story of writing this book.
Marty Ross-Dolen is our guest. The book is Always There, Always Gone. Her website is Marty Ross, Dolen, martyrossdolen.com. From your grandmother's letters, what is the picture you've painted in your mind about the woman she was?
I had always known about her because my mom did tell me stories as I was growing up. And I knew that she was a very unique and extraordinary person. But I became really aware of that through reading her letters. And these letters start from when she's young, I'd say the bulk of them start at age 14 when she was away at summer camp. And she was writing, I was not writing the way she was writing when I was 14. She writes beautifully. She writes clearly. She's very creative. She's hilarious, just witty, has a fantastic sense of humor. She has a great sense of herself. And she carried that all the way into her adulthood until at age 38 when her life ended. And she was very passionate about everything. Everything she would write about, she was passionate about. She eventually became incredibly passionate about her 5 children, which she wrote about at length to her parents, and about her husband and her family and her work. But I know that she was a magnetic person, and she was a unique person.
You describe your mom as living in protracted grief. What was that like through your eyes as her daughter?
My mom was 14 years old when she lost her parents suddenly, tragically. And she grew up, this was at a time, 1960, where the reaction to tragedy like that was not necessarily the way we react now. It was a time where people really closed up and didn't talk and had the mentality of moving on and soldiering on, is what they would say. So my mom, in losing her parents, then ended up having no real opportunity to process her grief. 6 years later, I was born when she was 20. She was 19, actually, just a few weeks before she turned 20. And so my experience as I became I was always a sensitive person. As a child, I was sensitive. I was very aware of how other people feeling. I would always try to understand what other people were thinking and feeling. And it was clear to me that anytime the topic of her parents came up and she started to burst into tears, it became clear to me that this was not a topic to discuss. And so now in retrospect, I call it protracted mourning or protracted grief, because had she had a different kind of response from the people around her in 1960, I don't know that she would have been as that she would have necessarily struggled like she did as I was growing up. And so that's how I perceive it.
And there had to be some transference of that grief to you. What did that feel like?
No child likes to see their parents cry. That's just, I think, normal. And sure, like it was both difficult to know that she was struggling, and it was also really hard for me to process this very tragic, very horrific thing that happened to people that I was named for my grandmother, people that I felt like I should have known, wished I had known, and never would know. And so I had my own sense of trying to understand, just a lot of fear, concern about just the nature of their death and just dying in general as a young child. But I also will say that silence that my mother grew up in around the loss of her parents, was also because I avoided the topic, she avoided the topic, and we lived in this state of, I say, partners in mourning. I was also raised in the same silence. So I think that also impacted me.
Is it possible to heal inherited trauma?
Heal.
Interesting word.
I know it is, because I do find for sure that my process of writing was a healing process. So I'm a different person than the person before I had written this book. It's always present. And I don't know, inherited trauma versus trauma in general, it's always there. It's just whether or not it's processed in a way that we can maybe think of it differently and also move forward with a sense of peace around it, as opposed to just a constant state of grief. I do think it's possible to not always be in a constant state of grief, but I don't believe that it just disappears.
Marty Ross-Dolen is our guest. We're talking about a beautifully titled book, Always There, Always Gone. Her website is martyrossdolen.com. Were there any surprises that you came across as you were putting this book together?
It's not a typical narrative, straightforward memoir. It is, someone might call it experimental, as you described, Terry, genre defying or genre bending. It has some experiments in there. It has some different ways of approaching stories. And in many ways, the surprises were around the way that I told it. And real surprises came around, for example, the sheer volume of letters was very overwhelming for me and somewhat paralyzing, because I wasn't sure how in the world I was going to take this material and consume it efficiently enough so that I could identify what should be in the book and share it in a way that anybody else would find it interesting besides me, which is ultimately the goal, right? I don't want to just put out just a small story without something that might have interest to others. In my sort of writing paralysis, I would take certain letters that spoke to me for some reason, and I just started to transcribe them. I would set them up like next to my desk on a paper stand kind of thing, and I would just start typing and transcribing. And the big surprise is that I started entering into the letter, and I became part of the scene. I would talk to my grandmother in the writing, and this was just not something in any way I had planned. I would start asking her questions and talking to her and imagining myself there with her and creating dialogue, and it became a strange surprise. It was a very painful process writing this book. And these surprises, these opportunities to play in the writing were very fun. I looked forward to them. So I would find different ways, different places that I could do some of that so that I could give myself a break from the painful parts. And initially, I wasn't sure. I was working with faculty advisors from my program, and I wasn't sure. They weren't sure. Was this going to go in the book? What was happening here? What was I doing? You might call it speculative nonfiction or speculative writing. Does that fit? Can you do that in memoir? And ultimately, as I proceeded with it and went deeper into the process, I started to realize that what was happening was that I was becoming connected to my grandmother in a very different way, that I was actually feeling like I even knew her, like she wasn't a stranger to me anymore. And largely that's because when you read a lot of letters, you absorb a person's voice. But then also I started having conversations with that voice. So as long as I was clear with the reader that I wasn't believing that this was true, that I was actually there in 1937 in this letter, I decided that this was an important thing to include in my memoir, that this process was what was going to propel the story forward.
It is a psychiatric protocol. Works well in some cases. It sounds like it worked for you.
It did, for sure.
Did you ask questions of your grandmother? And if so, what did you hear back?
I wanted to know, yes, if she was happy with the decisions she was making, because the decisions that she made were, like we all do, make life decisions that lead to our destinies. And I, throughout reading her letters, wanted to know if she was making decisions in her life that were guiding her in the right direction. And she would tell me by letting me see in the letters that she was continuing to be happy. And not that she wasn't, like any of us, distressed about a bad grade, distressed about the state of the world, World War II time, and challenged by her children. But she always seemed to be conveying that the decisions she was making in her life were the right ones. And that was something I had always wondered. Did she really want to have 5 children? I wondered that. Was that something that she had wanted to have? A lot of women don't choose that, to have 5 children. This was at a time when it was more common to have larger families. But it became very clear to me that she loved having 5 children. She loved each of them, and she was thrilled with her role as a mom. So that's the kind of question I asked, and she answered through her writing.
One of the surprises for me as I was researching for this conversation was your family's connection to a series that I grew up reading, Highlights for Children. Did that put any additional pressure on you as you were writing this thing?
I think that I knew that Highlights would offer a way to connect with a lot of people, because a lot of people know Highlights and have very fond memories of Highlights and attachments to it. And I did too. I was a Highlights kid like anybody. It was in my house. It was in my doctors and dentists' offices. That in itself, as memoirists, we're always looking for universal connections to readers. That was a place where I felt that people could enter into my story with some familiarity. Whether I had any kind of, I think you asked, pressure, or my book was never meant to be the history of Highlights. My grandparents were instrumental in they are the history of Highlights. They saved the company. It's around now almost 80 years, and it wouldn't be had they not been there to save it from bankruptcy more than once. So their story is an important one in that way. It means that children through generations were able to connect to this special magazine and company. But I was trying to figure out how to write it without making it be all about Highlights.
Always There, Always Gone is the name of the book. What has the response been from readers? You've had amazing reviews from the pros. What does the average person think of this book?
I've been really moved by the responses. first of all, people appreciate the style of the structure and the style of writing what's different. And it doesn't seem to be something that, because it's not typical, it doesn't mean that people aren't still interested in reading it. But what's been the most impressive thing to me is how much people are connecting with this idea of multi-generational trauma of all kinds. I've heard a couple of stories of people whose grandmothers died in childbirth. I've heard stories of brothers and sons who died in accidents and just losing parents in teenagehood, and just lots of stories. And the bottom line is, we all have our stories. You don't have to scratch too deep to find trauma when you look at generations of human life. It's just part of being human. And particularly when you look at the 20th century, I think. Now, obviously, we're 25 years past the 20th century, and we've certainly had our share of tragedies and trauma in these last 25 years too. But there's something about that 20th century. And I think part of it is because many of us either lived in it or are connected with our ancestors that lived in it. But one of the main issues that we now, living in modern times, experience through our generations of ancestors is a time which would maybe be more 19th, 18th century, when people readily lost children in epidemics. I actually have a story in my family, and I wrote an essay about it, where I think it's 6 children in 11 days died of diphtheria in one family. And that family produced later, in their second set of children, my great-grandmother, who is the mother of my grandfather that died in the airplane accident, who did not want to talk about that death. And so I just feel like we've been trained through generations of trauma to handle, because we have to move forward and move on. And I think that common loss of children and loss to disease, but also to war, I think has set us up as human beings to just look ahead and move forward. I think now, in modern times, when we have treatments, we have vaccinations, we have antibiotics, we have certainly less war on our land, that we don't relate as much to that level of loss that our ancestors did. So now we question, like, how could they not have talked about losing your parents? Like, that seems like that would have been something where the kids needed to be in therapy, needed to do all of the different processing that they needed to do that we need to do now. Like, what was wrong with them? Actually, they were doing the best they could. And now we have a different time and we can look at it differently. But I still think we carry all that in us.
That is a maxim. Everybody is carrying a burden that we cannot see. Based upon your experience in life, in psychiatric practice, and now through writing this amazing book, what advice do you have for people about how to cope and move forward in such uncertain times with burdens like this?
I think based on my experience and my training, my advice is to just give it oxygen. Talk, write, process. Don't hold back. Talk to your children. If you're going to break some of these cycles, talk to your children in ways that are appropriate for them, but don't make anything off limits, and process it yourself. No matter how old you are, there's still time to process and to see things differently. One thing I will say is that I wrote my memoir. I came to it from a place of love. And I think it's easy to write, and I did, from a place of sadness or from a place of anger. And I did write from those places. But I ultimately chose to include and focus on the writing that was coming from a place of love. And when I say that, what I mean is holding within me a certain level of generosity toward those people, knowing they were flawed, knowing they had limits, knowing their lives were different, they were living in a different time, and giving them the grace to believe that they were doing the best they could with what they had. And if I have that state of mind as I'm writing and understanding my own experience, my relationship with my mother and my family members, my mother's experience, I come at it in a way that I actually transform how I think about it. And that is where the healing is, because I don't think about this in the way that I used to. I think about my grandparents who lost their lives at age 38 as having lived a full lives, both of them. I don't see the decisions that were made around me that impacted me as a child, the parenting decisions, whatever. I see from a place of doing the best they could. And when I have that mentality and I see myself, I give myself that grace too, that I was doing the best I could at all of these times. And that now I'm able to give myself permission. I certainly gave myself permission while writing to feel that anger and to feel that sadness, but then to pull the part of love out of it is what ultimately made me put the period at the end of the sentence and say the end.
What has been your mom's reaction to all of this?
So my mom has always been my biggest cheerleader with my writing. She's always been, I give anything I write to my husband and to my mom at the same time. So I have two first readers. She always encouraged me, and she gave me 100% full permission to write whatever I needed to write. That's really unique for a memoir. I'm very grateful for it, and I know that I'm very fortunate. She just didn't put any restrictions and accepted whatever it was that I was going to write. While I was reading the letters, which was probably over about a 6-month period, maybe longer, honestly, we got on the phone almost daily through that process, because I would want to talk to her about, did she remember this thing that I just read? Or did she know this thing that I just read? Or she'd want to fill in some details that I wasn't getting or tell me what she remembered. Those conversations could be up to a couple of hours long, involved a lot of laughter and involved a lot of tears. And they were exhausting. And that was part of the exhaustion of those days, was the intense connection with my mom through that process. But throughout that, she didn't actually want to know how I was writing the book. She wasn't really ready until the very end when I completed it. And she said, okay, I'll read it now. And she was surprised, because the way I ended up writing it is just so atypical that I'm not sure she would have said, oh, she's going to do some of these weird things that she did. I think on some level she thought that it might be a little bit more biography of my grandmother. But she also knew that it was going to be about myself and about her too. But ultimately she read it through tears, and she ultimately loves it, and she's proud of it, and she's proud to have me putting it into the world. And I'm just very grateful for that.
It's a wonderful book, always there, always gone, written by our special guest, Marty Ross-Dolen. You can find out more about her and about the book at martyrossdolen.com. Marty, thanks so much for a wonderful visit.
Thank you, Terry. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
In Conversation with Terry Shepard is a copyrighted presentation. All rights reserved. I'm Lisa Davis. Join Terry Shepard next time in Conversation.